Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Anna Smith, and I'm excited to have you join us for the second session of the 2025 Creatively Critical Tech Research Design Practice Speaker Series. So I have some introductory remarks. So that's something for me to do. So I have something for you to do. I would like you to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. And this might be questions that you bring tonight or where you're coming from, some kind of introduction in the chat bar. So the chat is in the bottom screen. There's an option to chat, and then make sure it's selected to everyone. It has a little radial dial, and then go ahead and introduce yourself. And then we're keeping the chat open for the most dialogic experience possible. So please respect that and keep our comments productive and sharing and with that. So the Creatively Critical Tech series comes to us from the Education Now Lab at Illinois State University. We are a community engaged research practice lab that uses immersive and emerging technologies to inquire and produce a range of critical, interdisciplinary, public, academic, new media scholarship with and alongside community members as we labor together toward more educational futures. I'm going to drop in the chat some links to our site, where we are across social media. With those links, you can find some video recordings from previous talks or our current talks that are upcoming, where to register for those. So I'll drop those in the chat in just a minute. And this series is sponsored through an Advancing Research and Creative Scholarship Tier 2 grant from the ISU Office of Research, and we thank them for their support. And in that, we also recognize the continuous ways that our work at Illinois State University is supported by histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution the last 160 plus years. Specifically, the harm inflicted by our institution being built on the land and waterways of multiple indigenous nations who were forcibly removed, including the Illini, Peoria, and the Miami, among others. And so, we had a version of this series. I think it was 2 years ago. We had our first series, and I ended that by thinking, oh, I need to say something about our current moment and thinking about dispossession and sustained struggles. And so I am sad to repeat what I've had to say now over the last couple of years, so that as we're currently seeing the sustained struggles and atrocities happening to peoples and lands in current events, I hope we can dedicate tonight's the insights, the energy we gain from tonight toward action, however would be best for our common humanity, communal well-being, and flourishing. So with that, I'm going to turn over to one of our doctoral students, and I think I can allow you to unmute Annie. Let's see, maybe. And she's going to introduce our speaker today.
Yes, I will be. Hi, and I'm Ann Holdren, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Roderic Crooks. Roderic Crooks is an associate professor in the Department of Informatics at UC Irvine. His research examines how the use of digital technology contributes to the oppression of working class community of color. His current project explores how community organizers and working class communities of color use data for activist projects, even as they dispute the proliferation of data-intensive technologies in education, law enforcement, financial services, and other vital sites of public life. He has published extensively in the human-computer interaction, science and technology studies, and social science venues on topics including political theories of online participation, equity of access, and document theory. Welcome, Dr. Crooks. It's such an honor to have you with all of us tonight.
Yeah, thanks very much. And also, thank you, Dr. Smith. I'll have more thank yous at the end. Also, I saw the bill. The other scholars who are coming are great. So I'm honored to be in your company and also in their company. I did bring slides. I don't know if that's customary for this series. I'll try to be brief, but can I share those? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Great. Okay, can everybody see those? No audio, so it'll just be pictures. Okay, great. I'm just going to jump in. So what I want to do in this talk is I'm going to talk about parts of my book. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do the whole thing. And to do that, I first want to kind of like set the ground to talk about some terms I use in this book, some kind of theories that I borrow from social science and other places to kind of put together my work on access. After I tell you those terms, I'll repeat kind of what the central argument of this book is. And then I'll take you through a couple of two of the three field sites that make up the bulk of this book. And then I too am going to end on talking about dispossession, talking about how we might want to think about action with respect to dispossession. And so that's what I'm going to do. But broadly speaking, my argument is about how data-intensive computation delivers value to privileged individuals or maybe even privileged organizations, but never to the communities that are enjoined to host these technological interventions. I'm saying that what access to technology as a focus makes us do is that it makes us configure a certain resource field that extracts capital from minoritized communities to the tech sector, also from the state to the tech sector. So mostly what I do in this book is I look at what people do in the name of access or in the interest of creating access and try to figure out what those resources are and who has to provide them. So that's what this book is about. So to do this work, I borrow a few theories. One I write about is datafication. And so this is a term that you may have seen used. There's a scholarship on datafication in the state. Datafication can sort of be described sector-wide or industry-wide. I write mostly about the datafication of everyday life and, of course, the datafication of schooling. So datafication is kind of on par, I guess, with earlier research about computerization. But datafication research tends to equally prioritize, let's say, material technological change, and then also these concomitant meanings that kind of drive us towards computers or digital technologies more generally. So I say datafication is computers or data-intensive technologies or centers where there were not computers before your dating life, say, but then also this set of cultural understandings that turn us towards data and data-drivenness in the first place. And these ideologies make us give us a certain trust in data and give us a certain desire and sometimes even pleasure in knowing the world via data. And one thing I want to flag is that I'm deeply skeptical of this approach to data. As I argue throughout the book, data don't have independent meaning. They are given meaning through interpretation by machines and humans. Data are shaped via labor. They are given and infused with meaning. So as much as it might be, let's say, egalitarian to imagine that there are kind of patterns out in the world and that collecting data to know those patterns would let us know and change the world, I find that on the whole, that way of thinking about data tends to erase the value of labor, particularly for minoritized peoples. Let's talk about minoritized. So this is a term I borrow a lot from American studies. I'd heard it said by my colleagues that after I started working at UC Irvine and publishing in spaces that were about technology, they also switched to using the term minoritized, which I have mixed feelings about. I myself borrowed the term from American studies, particularly the work of Munoz and also the scholar Roderic Ferguson. I use this term minoritized to remind the reader and also myself that when we are talking about race, class, sex, documentation, disability, geography, we're not necessarily talking about demography. We are talking about power. And so how a particular group is constituted and what constitutes difference within group is determined wholly by power. For people who live in the communities that I come from and that I study, these are working class communities of color here in California. It makes us think about how the public sphere is defined and constituted according to principles of white supremacy and also according to principles of class, wealth, and privilege, which consistently renders people, especially students in the schools I'm going to tell you about in a minute, as targets of surveillance who are invisible, who are misgendered, or who are perhaps even hypervisible in the context of law enforcement. But what I want to say, I want to remind, I guess, the audience and myself, that the scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that minoritized peoples here in the United States are part of the global supermajority of modestly educated working people and their extended communities. I've done a lot of borrowing, I realize. I got a couple more, but again, I put all these together, and then this is how I study the things I study. I use this term racial formation from the quite famous work of Omi and Wynant. This is the theory of race and racialization that I depend on in this book. I should say also there's all kinds of other theories of race. There's critical race theory, there's racial capitalism. Those are not the theories that I used in this particular work. And I make sure to flag that there are scholars with that expertise who use those terms. I think mostly I wanted to be careful to say I chose this particular approach because it did something that I wanted it to do. It was useful for the thing I wanted it to look at, not because I thought this was the only way to study race and racialization in the context of schools or in the context of public life. So the part that was useful about, or I'd say desirable for me in this particular theory, as it is articulated in racial formation theory by Omi and Wynant, race changes over time, and the categories that are possible to be animated and used about race are historically contingent. They're shaped and they change over time. So what it means to be white at a certain place in time is different than what it means to be at another time. And Omi and Wynant describe this kind of functions of racial formations, and they end up on this idea of a racial project. And so the racial project for Omi and Wynant is an explanatory framework, but it is also a distribution of resources along racial lines. So the racial project has a kind of 1-2 sort of function, which is that we have a system of representation that justifies the distribution of resources, but that they happen together, and that is the racial project. So in this framing, both segregated public education and the tech sector can be thought of as racial projects. And so here is a term of my own devising, datalogical and framing. This is how organizations, the organizations that I'm studying, busy themselves with seemingly objective digital data in order to accommodate racial projects. I cite Ruha Benjamin here, who says of the role of race in technology that we should attend to the productive in the generic sense of producing things, not in the normative sense of necessarily beneficial functions of race within technical systems. So I really took that as stage direction to pay attention to how racial projects were functioning both in public schooling and then in kind of ed tech applied to public schooling. Racial projects figure in public education, certainly, but also in the impetus to become data-driven in the first place. Okay, that's the end of my vocabulary section. So to put that all together, here's what I'm arguing in this book, and this is what I've been arguing since 2016. So I'm saying that EdTech deployed in the name of access for the benefit, the social justice virtue of access to technology, let's say, extracts resources from minoritized communities, and in so doing supports the racial project of segregated public education via datalogical and framing. So then I go through the various chapters of the book, these 3 field sites, and I kind of look at what that means. I also want to point out there are other resources that are extracted in the use of EdTech in the communities that I'm studying. I talk in other places about time. I talk about labor. I talk about attention. But in this book, I focus mostly on data. Okay. I guess I want to pause here also to say a little something about my own positionality approaching these issues. So I am from a working class family from Southern California, from what is Hyde Park is the name of the neighborhood, but some people call it, it has been kind of known, I would say controversially, as South Central Los Angeles. Not everybody calls that part of town South Central Los Angeles, or always did. But that's what we called it when I was growing up. The field work that I do is also started in South Central Los Angeles, and a lot of the 2 of the 3 sites that I'm working on are in South Central Los Angeles. Another one is in East Los Angeles, which is another working class community just across town, say. And so I do have a lot of experience, personal experience of mass incarceration, of family policing, of economic precarity. I am, to use terms that I learned from some of the community organizers that I'm going to end this talk with, systems impacted. So that really shaped kind of what I thought about what I was doing. And in the first case, I kind of came to this research thinking that I was going to go out and I was going to find what people in my community were doing with technology and really like hold this up and be like, look, we're doing innovation, like we are worthy of these particular kinds of investments. And so what I saw when I went out was this real kind of deep and purposive ambivalence, where people recognized that a resource was being offered or they could get at some resource. And then they sort of took that resource and then went on and did whatever they were going to do in the first place. So in many cases, these kind of stories about access and these big like promises about what access was going to do were being repeated by people from within the community, by teachers, sometimes parents. So it was not always the case that this is some case of false consciousness by, manipulative entrepreneurs who are sort of coming to our community to raid things. It's a kind of larger story. And so how people accommodate that larger story and the sort of compromises and tactical choices that they make in order to pursue their own ends is what analytically guided me through this material. So I'll just quickly run through the first sort of field study, and this is how I got started. Again, at this point, I'm a graduate student, really excited about technology. I went to a school in my home neighborhood, and I was like, "Hey, I'm a graduate student at UCLA," and I got a lot of support from people in the school. In some ways, they were like, "Oh yeah, this guy, he can, uh, 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 model for the students, what is graduate school? How do you go to college?" Which I did a fair amount of that work and was quite happy to do it. But this is a school that was really wrapped up in innovation. It's a charter school, again, in my home community, kind of small, like around 650 people. There were four principals, four counselors, and let's say 25 teachers, depending. This school, though, is completely racially segregated in the way that schools in working class neighborhoods in California are segregated. So 95% of students in the school are Latino, 4% were Black. That 1% of students unaccounted for there are students who were mixed or claimed more than one kind of ancestry. At no point at any time in all the years I was at that school was there ever a white or Asian student. And so that is how segregation functions in the working class communities of Southern California. Essentially, Black and Latino students attend one set of schools, white and Asian students attend another set of schools. Again, that the levels can vary. This is probably one of the more extreme examples. But the important thing is the charter school network that I studied in this chapter, and a different charter school network that I studied in the second chapter, all the schools that they work in are so segregated. Segregated, I mean, in this exact manner and at this exact or close to this exact level. So the schools exist really to service these communities and to work in these segregated communities. And there's a lot of kind of alongside this rhetoric of access to technology, there is an equal access of failure, of the inability of schools to do what they want to do. There is no rhetoric of school segregation. So the fact that the schools are segregated is never really like overtly addressed by anyone. But these schools, these new school organizations, these charter schools, charter management organizations are relatively recent entrance into this kind of space of education reform, and they serve these schools exclusively. Their whole reason for existing is to serve schools in these communities. I like to share this image. This is from the school where I went for a few years. Again, in retrospect, I enjoyed unusual access myself at this school because the people in the community really let me come in and they let me spend several years there. They let me look at whatever I wanted to look at. In many cases, I went to students' homes and met their parents. I went to church with some students, went to the job fair, went to prom and graduation. So I got kind of involved in the life of the school for a few years. And this image kind of shows what it was like there. This is an image, a mural that was produced by teachers and students at the school themselves. They painted this. Students planned it. There was like a contest. They all participated, and then they came together on the Harvey Milk Day of Service one year and executed it. So I like this image because it shows the sort of industriousness, the creativity of this community. You can see a certain kind of fantastical image of multiracial society here. You have Harvey Milk next to Dr. King, next to Chavez, next to Malala. So it shows really the kind of productivity of this community, this creativity of this community, excuse me. But then you also see this kind of dark skyline here. This is the skyline of downtown Los Angeles, which is visible from the school, really hovering like a kind of a dark specter, a kind of distant but unseeable horizon. And this reminds us that working class communities, such as this one where the school is, are always located in sort of social proximity and in economic proximity to the richer communities they support. So this is a community that really exists just a stone's throw away from tremendous wealth and influence. Many of the parents in the community leave the community every day to go into other parts of Los Angeles, richer parts of Los Angeles to work, downtown, Beverly Hills. And also many of the students themselves also have jobs in those communities where they go every day and work. Another thing I like about this image too is that if you look on top of the mural, you'll see a small surveillance camera there. And so it reminds us that in our communities, we are subject constantly to this sort of gaze of authority everywhere, even in our artistic expressions, in our work. So this kind of puts it all together for me, what it was like to spend time there. Oh, also, murals are a really important art form in Los Angeles, so I like that too. Okay, so here's what I saw in this program, this school, they gave everybody an iPad. And so I spent a few years just kind of following these devices around to see what people did with them. Look on the left, you'll see these kind of safes lined up. These are armored charging bays that they have to keep the iPads in so that they don't get stolen. So in order to kind of accommodate this technology that was promised to provide access, provided in the name of social justice, we had to move around a lot of stuff. And so in this case, there's a significant investment of space that is tied up just to store the iPads and their cables, space being at a real premium in this school, which has no gymnasium, no cafeteria, no library. So there aren't space for those things, but then we can make space for these the kind of heavy footprint of these devices that are promoted, as having to do with air and having to do with the cloud and being sort of ephemeral. That picture was also taken by a teacher who used the tablet that she had been given to sort of document some of the conditions in the school that were rubbing her the wrong way. So in some ways, this project became a way for teachers and students to talk about their lived experience with these devices rather than these sort of promises of access. On the right, you see some students. There they are re-indexing the charging cables and the cases and the tablets themselves, keeping kind of careful records of every device's serial number, but also they've numbered every charging cable and they've numbered all the little charging bricks and they've numbered all the cases. And they're keeping very kind of elaborate records to make sure that everything stays where it's supposed to go. So this is an investment of labor. So you see the students doing these clerical work, also those heavy charging carts that are there. Sometimes they would do sort of work with tools to work on the carts themselves. So just an extremely heterogeneous set of labor that students had to do in order to keep access for the school. The students that you're looking at are called student technology leaders. They are volunteer student workers. On average, they reported to me spending over 3 hours per day doing IT work instead of schoolwork, for which they received no compensation. So this is another sort of extraction that happens in the name of access, this one being labor. But again, my focus throughout the book is mostly on data, but I did want to just signpost that there are a lot of other extractions happening here as well. So again, these were the kids who I had the most in common with. They were nerdy kids like me. They were kids who were kind of simultaneously gifted, but also at risk, to borrow the language of my colleague, Patricia Garcia. So because I kind of was a computer nerd myself, we bonded and I spent just a few years with these kids, kind of watching all the different kinds of work that they did and getting to know them, watching them graduate and so on. So what I found there in that section of the book, I talk about these devices, I talk about their arrival, I talk about all these like labor and extractions that have to happen, but there's a real strong at that moment kind of domestication of those devices as the school kind of figures out what they want to do with them. And the first part of that is the teachers, for the most part, decide to ignore them. And so the devices are not really incorporated into instruction in any meaningful way, but the school administration finds many uses for them. And that mostly involves standardized test taking and surveillance. So there's a real pivot after, say, a year of experimentation, where the devices essentially are used just for standardized testing and just for surveillance. There's a third use there that happens when some people at the school realize that they can access data that was produced by the tablets to kind of track teachers and students and come up with different metrics. But that's a very strong, I would say, I just want to shorthand that as a sort of pivot to surveillance. And I spent some time in the book talking about that. I spend a long time in the book after that talking about data that comes from these devices and where it goes and who can look at it, kind of what happens there. And we can talk some more about that if you want, but I'm going to jump ahead to the third sort of section of the book, the third field site, which is this kind of ongoing work that I have been doing with community organizers based in the same working class communities. So the community organizers that I'm in conversation with, at least some of them come from they all come from working class communities somewhere in the United States. But most of them, I began working with community organizers in these very same communities in South and East Los Angeles. Um, Community organizing is a form of political activity, often called grassroots community organizing, and that's where people who live in the community are thought to have some expertise in problems and identifying problems. And so the goal of political activism and participation is not to say, like, get the interest of elites, it's to build power within the community itself. So community organizers want to build power in the community to address the problems that they themselves have identified. It is a form of political activism that is, let's say, valorized and effective in working class communities of color for some reasons that we could talk about in the Q&A, but it is a powerful form of political activity for groups that can never be the statistical majority. And it's also related to larger social movements, movement for Black life, ecological movements, prison abolition, and so on. So community organizers who are working with data are in what I call a double bind, and that is that working with data can be an effective political tool, but working with data can get you wrapped up in some things that you maybe don't want to get wrapped up in. And that is because data are theory laden. Remember at the top of the talk, I was talking about some of these problems and the representational capacities of data. That's the thing you might get wrapped up in that you don't want to get wrapped up in. And data can reify in a variety of ways the assumptions of white supremacy that make data valorized in the first place. So this process of data logical and framing that I have described in that first section of the book here also occurs in political activism in working class communities of color. That activism is also data logically inframed. And that means the communities of color are frequently responsible for producing data about harms that are already known to the state, frequently using data that is produced by the state. So an example of that would be some of the activists some of the organizers who I work with, who assemble databases of cases where police have killed people in the community. Again, the number of people who are killed by police in the community, they use records from police themselves to produce those databases, as well as kind of adding testimony from people in the community and other sorts of kind of crowdsourced information. But the harm that they are trying to describe, police killing people in the community, is already known to people in the community, and it's already known to the state. So the argument or the sort of premise that that has to be presented as data is itself a symptom of this data logical inframing. I described the work of community organizers in terms of political agonism, of political theory from Chantal Mouffe, who says briefly that in the absence of consensus-based politics, that what we might look for instead is a sort of contest of meaning that brings groups of people together. That the real value of democratic society is not that there is a sort of consensus about actions that should be taken, but that groups can come together to agitate for the kinds of changes that they want to see in society, and that this kind of clash and this negotiation over power is in fact purposive, productive, and desirable for a democratic society. Community organizers that I'm working with will never represent majority points of views, represent in the sense of their own kind of demographic characteristics, this kind of division of the public sphere by power that I'm talking about. But also, no one is coming to save them. So they have to build power themselves and kind of try to accomplish changes without necessarily hoping that the majority will come in and approve their right to live or organize or do whatever they want to do. So I have been meeting with community organizers here at UC Irvine every year, every other year since I started this job. So when I got this job as a professor, the most important thing to me, I was like, I'm going to bring community organizers to campus, and I'm going to treat them as I would any other scholar, just like you all are treating me now. I'll invite them to give a talk, and I'll respect their authority. And then also community organizers will use this space to cooperate with each other. And so they'll be able to build and network and kind of support each other's work. And if there are technological dimensions of this work, if, for example, certain community organizers want websites or they want databases or they want apps, we will build them because we have that capacity here in the School of Information and Computer Science. What we almost never do is produce research. So one thing that community organizers generally do not want is they do not want me or any other scholar to take the work that they do and present it as scholarship. So that has produced some I would say problems, but also it's taught me a lot and made me reflect a lot, like what I am trying to accomplish as a scholar and kind of what the value of scholarship can be. But it's not the work of community organizing. The work of community organizing is something separate. So here's what we do. This is a fairly standard deduce interface, but part of what I do is I pay community organizers as interview participants, and I also pay friends, colleagues of organizers, so like extended networks of organizers more than just the people I've met who come here. And I interview them about their work. I use an interview protocol that I developed to interview data scientists. And so I ask them what kinds of data they use, what they do with it, what their hopes are for it, what tools and platforms they use. In the context of their employment as community organizers. If you want to participate, you have to be a professional community organizer. So you have to have a job as a community organizer. And you also have to agree to participate in research. So sometimes being a professional community organizer has not been a problem, but sometimes we have interviewed people who are then like, actually, I don't want to participate in research. I don't want to share what I'm doing with my work for reasons that we could talk about, but mostly because they don't want me to like blow their strategy. They might want to like keep certain things to themselves. But briefly, I've written before just a sort of loose typology of what community organizers do with digital data in this context. And one way I've talked about it is as a kind of first of sort of refusal. So one thing that community organizers are very adamant about is that there are times when they do not wish their work to be represented as data. They do not want their actions to be described as data. And they also don't want data that they may have collected in one instance to travel somewhere else. And so I describe this as a kind of origin story for community organizers, that much of their work is rooted in an ethos of refusal. So here, I have a longer quote from this community organizer that I'm calling Rashawn, who works in criminal justice. And he talks about the time when he became a community organizer or what drew him to this work. He says, I say that I started as an organizer in 8th grade. I led a walk out of school because I had a teacher that was on some bullshit, like he was racist. And I was like, okay, we're not staying in this class. We're going to walk out. We're going to refuse to go back to this class. I feel like that was my first organizing experience. So this ethos of refusal runs through their data work. So this shows up mostly as one, a refusal to create data, a refusal to share data, and also a refusal to allow that data is a superior way of knowing than what is already experientially known in the community. Another aspect of the data work or the data practices of community organizers that I point to is respect. And so I say that this data work is secondary to relations within the community. So community organizers in the interviews that I do with them, they've devoted significant time to the lived experiences of community members, to making sure that data does not become privileged over the wisdom and experience held collectively in the community. So in the example I gave you earlier, in the organizers who work on police homicides, they are really angry when academics or journalists use the data that they have created and remove that data from the context that they have created. For example, including the name of the person who was killed, victim impact statements of the survivors of that person who was killed, and eyewitness accounts of people who observed the instance. So community organizers spend a lot of time maintaining that very bespoke, very sensitive, very community-based kind of data, and are very, very protective of it. And then finally, again, these are just sort of loose types. Community organizing is a confrontational activity. And so here, we talk about receipts. And so one way that community organizers try to use data is they take data, frequently data that is produced by the state, and they use it to kind of embarrass or intimidate or to make demands of elected officials who work elsewhere for the state. So here, Shauna, who works in environmental justice, says, we know this data is being collected, but governmental agencies are really good at hiding that, either by not having it visible, by making it so you can only get the data you want if you go to this one office in City Hall with a pencil and a notepad and copy it down. They would say, oh, this is all public available, but the barriers are there, and sometimes you have to push. Sometimes a push is not enough. Sometimes you need to make threats. We do the Freedom of Information Act often to get stuff because it's more likely to produce results if you're getting stonewalled. So here she's talking about how she demands records from City Hall to then take to some other place to demonstrate some harm that the state itself is producing. So this is perhaps the best use case of data for the organizers that we've talked about. And it also speaks to the hostile relationships that organizers have with elected and unelected officials. So by way of wrapping up, I want to just kind of point to three places where I end this book and three things that I kind of think about moving out of this work and what I'm going to sort of take forward. One thing I think a lot about is I think about datafication, I think about state violence. This is an example of a data collection app that was used this year to collect data on journalists at protests. This is a mobile app that is device and network agnostic and easy to use. It makes me think about how a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about technology or we're talking about access could be explained by state violence. And so, I mean, we're talking almost every place that I'm talking about, we're talking about communities, segregated communities that are created through state policies like redlining, segregated schools that are created through education policies. So we can fiddle around with data, but ultimately we might be talking about it might be more productive to just talk about state violence. And so state violence is something I had been thinking about a lot. Certainly current events have made me think about it a lot more. But maybe a more productive focus would be to think on who the state is allowed to harm or even required to harm and who the state serves. I also have been thinking again and again and again about interpretation, and I've been thinking about how data are presumed in the mode of the natural sciences to stand in independent relationship for some like entity for which they serve as proxy, and how that understanding has seeped into so many other things. I'll say it again, data by itself doesn't mean anything. Data is given meaning through interpretive acts, analytically, politically, we should focus again and again and again on interpretation. What kinds of interpretations have been made? Can we recreate those interpretations? Can we question and push back on those interpretations? Or ultimately, how can we move towards more liberatory, more freeing interpretations? And then I have also been thinking a lot about Black political traditions, including the Black radical tradition. This is a wonderful book by Jana Brown, which is about cultural production and how cultural production, particularly Black women's cultural production, going back to the 1830s, is linked to a larger project of Black liberation. She writes about Black women such as Sojourner Truth and Rebecca Cox Jackson, Alice Coltrane, Sun Ra, Samuel Delany, and Octavia Butler, uh, as they reconfigure and challenge again and again what it means to be human, and how utopia might not be some place out there, but it might be some other way of making meaning. And I want to end just by kind of giving the conclusion, I guess, to this idea of people's community control of technology. People's community control of technology was a demand of the Black Panther Party that was kind of amended to their 10-point program, their quite famous 10-point program. They added language about technology around 1982. And so their amended point says, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and people's community control of technology. People's community of control of technology is not ever defined, but I do think it's a good place for us to move ourselves towards, or maybe to work towards. So people's community control of technology to me would mean that the value that goes into something like access to technology or something like EdTech, the value that goes into processing, circulating, and creating many kinds of data, that value would accumulate to the community of itself, the community itself, that would accumulate to working class communities of color. And again, this would be of a piece with this long, unaccomplished generational work of liberation, seeking a more free society for all the people who live in it. And so I'm arguing at the end of this book, as I point to this articulation of people's community control of technology, that this is the end, that maybe this is the action we could take. This is the place we could point ourselves towards as researchers, as policymakers, as community members, as practitioners who are interested in seeking liberation, that we could direct our efforts towards a goal like this and acknowledge that no technology, however charming or clever, could accomplish the difficult work of seeking liberation. But if we are willing to work through ambiguity and ambivalence, we might be able to think of modest, situated ways that technological practice might aid in this work. Okay, so that's it for the formal part of the talk. I want to thank my lab. Those are the doctoral students, master's students, undergraduates that I work with here at the Evoke Lab at UC Irvine. And of course, I want to thank the many community organizers that we have worked with over the years. with whom we have formed what we called in a recent writing critical connections. Thank you, Dr. Smith, Education Now. Thank you also, Anne, for introducing me. And I donate any speaking fees or book publishing fees I get back to community organizers. And this year, I am giving any money that's associated with this or any other talk to Measure. I put their website there. It's a really great Black woman-led organization that uses data to try to improve the conditions in their community. Oh, and I'll leave the bibliography up here in case anyone's interested.
Thank you so much. So much to think with and think about. We have some time for some questions. And so if you want to use there's a Q&A space, you can use that, or you can just type it right in the chat if you'd like. We still have your shared screen. I don't know if you want that one. We're seeing
Let me see.
your desktop.
Let me see if I can remember how to turn it off.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
I keep
All
getting
right.
worse at Zoom. Anyone else?
Oh, I have been doing that. Like I'll open it back up and I have no idea how to share my screen. I guess that's a form of refusal, right? So if you want to go ahead and take a moment to do that, I also have changed the settings so you can turn off your video. We may be able to have a question verbally if you want that. You can go ahead and raise your hand to do that. Maybe to launch this conversation. So with some of the doctoral students that I'm working with currently, we were just talking beforehand and thinking about learning from the community organizers around refusal. And refusal really necessitates some vulnerability in making yourself vulnerable, right? The students walking out are going to have consequences. And so we were doing that that juggle of like, okay, how do we keep our job and refuse? Thinking about examples that you've seen or that you have imagined of people's everyday refusal in educational spaces and how we can take that up. Again, learning from community organizers for the everyday things, schools that are being required to use certain apps for certain minutes, data that are collected, right? Parents sign off their rights to, right? All kinds of data that are collected around young people. They don't really have an option, right? Like either attend this class and use this thing, right? So where and how have you imagined, everyday refusal?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. So, one thing that I think is pretty interesting about a lot of the community organizers I work with, they are all now professional community organizers or have done that, but many times they've had other jobs, and sometimes they maintain other jobs, nurse, teacher, as they are also doing their community organizing work. So, one thing that I think it's important to distinguish maybe is to think about like, okay, we definitely want to learn from community organizers. I think we actually want to follow the leadership of community organizers. And so that's one reason why I think to kind of reflect on the importance of research or to think about like research is not the most important thing. I think really what the community organizers themselves are doing is the most important thing. And so I try to support organizers. So I guess one thing I think is you could support the refusal of others, even if you yourself did not feel positioned to like refuse a certain thing. And I saw a lot of that working in the school when kind of like the school was kind of instrumenting itself with these capacities of surveillance. I saw a lot of tolerance for mischief and a lot of tolerance for forgery and a lot of tolerance for, sloppy record keeping. In many cases, I saw people kind of playfully even exploiting that. So there's a great sense, I think, of fatalism around surveillance, that like we're all doomed, the panopticon is here, we're all trapped in webs of surveillance that we cannot escape from. So in some ways that's true, right? But I often feel reassured by how poor the data is and what a kind of poor proxy for reality is. It's if you want to use data to sell an ad, it's great, If you are vulnerable to state violence, there's probably going to be a great capacity of surveillance to harm you. But for a lot of people, it's just a lot of gibberish, right? Like what is being collected is not that useful. So to me, that frees us to at least explore strategies of obfuscation, playful strategies of fooling around. So in the instances you gave, school teachers and other kind of school personnel would have tremendous power to kind of tolerate all kinds of foolery, right? Like how good is your record keeping? How poor can you make it? I guess is one thing I would be curious about. Are you going to tolerate the sort of play with data and data creation of others. So I saw a lot of that where people knew that the data being collected was not very good, but they let it ride because it that relationship did something else. So I think that's one way you could think about it. So sure, we all want to be the one who is like heroically there, leading change and standing up to oppressive authorities, right? But that's quite romantic. But the things that organizers are asking for are concrete, they're material, they're real, and they involve resources. And so, one, give people the resources they ask for. And then, two, if you are not in a position to give people the resources that they ask for, you can support their efforts to get those resources, which, as we're saying, might involve you know, refusing to force them to produce particular kinds of records. It might involve, let's say, a tolerance on your part for particular kinds of misbehavior.
I like that.
Sure.
We had another question come in the Q&A space. In the classroom example, you mentioned how labor was being extracted based on how students spend their time on IT matters. Was there also an extraction of ideas or their thinking, or could there be in this kind of a setting?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, you know, I think I listed some things that I saw sort of being extracted, like unpaid extractions, right? The extraction implies that there was no reciprocal benefit that was exchanged. I don't know if students in the instance that I looked at, if their ideas were being extracted, but certainly I would say that's the direction that we're moving in. Since the time I wrote, these extractions have even just gotten like more intense, also more pronounced, and I would say slightly more sophisticated, because almost everything that I studied, there was a certain crudeness to it. It was not, in most cases, really sophisticated data analysis. And in almost every case, there was another, sorry, in every case, there was another layer or another sort of site of extraction. I was always only looking at some kind of extraction that was nested within some larger extraction. So, for example, I'm at this school and there's one principal, and he's figured out how to use data that is produced by the tablets to get teachers to do something that he wants them to do. I'll use your example, Dr. Smith, time on app. He's figured out how to monitor this and track this, and now he can reward or punish based on whether or not you have done the thing that he wants you to do. So in that instance, his ability to do that is pretty modest. It's pretty situated. He's got a bunch of other duties. He's one guy in this school. And so if he really decides to turn this into a thing, he can go and, maybe find some poor teacher who's maybe not liked or is vulnerable to being fired or disciplined in the first place. Although, as I write, that actually never happened, but he could have. But that extraction is nested within another level of extraction where people who work above the level of this school, let's say like the charter management organization or the district headquarters, they have access to all kinds of data that the people at the school don't have access to. So in that second section of the book, I sort of move up one layer to the sort of district headquarters where data from all the schools is available and look at sort of what they can do with it. But there also, I find that although people there had greater, let's say, technical skills, greater skills with data, the work there wasn't really like, let's make a model that predicts XYZ and then use that to punish, the following students who are produced, who are spit out that are non-compliant. They moved in that direction, and their work sometimes resembled that. They definitely produced models that tried to predict things based on, particular scores. Or I write kind of about this desire to create models that would predict student behavior. But even there, their ability to do this was a little bit crude. So they, for example, would constantly compare themselves to workers in, say, like the tech sector, like in private industry, who had a lot more resources, a lot more data scientists, a lot access to more powerful tools. But then we could even go one more, which is that like all these apps and platforms themselves are dealing with data from multiple school districts and multiple entities. So we can just keep abstracting up in this kind of like traffic and this sort of data economy. And so there's tons of extractions happening there. And I guess my feeling since I wrote this book is those extractions at the top have gotten more lucrative and more powerful. And then these kind of secondary, tertiary, these sort of those little extractions in there have stayed kind of the same. I don't see that the schools that are in my community that there is a lot greater technical capacity than there was, say, 10 years ago. Seems like it's about the same. But again, at the top, there's tremendous, it's just the scale is so hard for us to wrap our heads around, but it's at that larger scale, the app that has access to all the apps, to all the apps, to all the platforms, that's where these very tremendous extractions are happening. So ironically, though, we have seen that, right? Like Turnitin, the plagiarism detection software that has itself become a giant asset, a giant corpus of data that is valued at billions of dollars. I would say, to speak to the question, that constitutes that kind of theft, the theft of ideas and the theft of intellectual property. But the value of that theft accumulates high, high, high up, very at the highest levels, the level of venture capital, really. So I didn't see in the school someone saying like, "Oh, I'm stealing your idea, I'm stealing your approach because, I was able to see it in your writing via surveillance or some such." But I do think the theft of intellectual property is lucrative and happening at the highest levels of sort of tech and capital, if that answers the question. So no and yes.
Oh, yeah. When you said venture capitalists, like knowing how they're just buying other companies in order to accumulate all the data that are there.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's also important to note too that the data, whatever we think about what the data represents, whether it's made up of your papers or your comments, the data is an asset. That corpus of data has a value that is measured in dollars, and that
Yeah.
those dollars are real and have been exchanged. So however immaterial or abstract we think like this issue of what data represents is, the wealth is real.
Yeah, and it's not ours.
Yes, and you don't get it, and you don't get not one penny of it. That's exactly right. That's
Not
exactly
one
right.
penny. Fantastic. I'm watching the time, but I also want to make sure that people have been able to ask questions. If any others have come in, you can also raise your hand or put them in the chat, give it a chance. We also have several from our School of Creative Technologies thinking around design. So if there's a question around data and design, I welcome those questions too. I know we've got a whole class of design and aesthetic issues here as well. Let's give it a second to see if anyone
Yeah,
else
take your
has a
time.
question. Right.
I also, while I'm waiting, I definitely just wanted to thank you for like engaging with this book. Like you write a book and you just literally have no idea what's ever going to happen. So to see people who like actually engage with it, I think attention is like a gift. So I definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, time and attention. Talk about other ways of valuing something. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
There. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and being with us and your expertise and the community and the communities that shared of theirs as well that you were able to share with in your book and tonight. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I was pleased to be here. Thank you again for having me.
Yeah, you bet. All right. Thank you so much. We'll see you.